Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome to our favorite Tuesday of the month when we get to talk to Harley Schlanger. Harley, it's so great to have you back, and how are you today?
Doing pretty well. It's a hectic day, lots of things going on.
Oh my goodness, yes. I will. I'll just tell you my feeling today is just overshadowed by this new attack in Gaza, where all of these civilians have been killed and children, and it just weighs me down, and I don't know how the world is interpreting this. Is this a breach of the ceasefire? Is nothing going to happen? What can you tell us about this event?
Well, I can start by saying that in the last week, I've been working on an article on this whole question of what is the Israeli national security policy. And there's a very important military historian who's making an interesting point, which is that Israel does not really have a national security policy. It's relying on something from 1923 called the Iron Wall, which is that Israel must have a strong enough military and an ability to destroy its enemies in order to force the Arab population to accept the existence of the state of Israel. And it's dependent on deterrence, surveillance, and decisive victory. And this is associated with, from 1923, with Jabotinsky, who was the head of the revisionist wing of the Zionist movement, which is the Netanyahu wing today. Now, the modern historians are making the point that even though initially Ben-Gurion opposed this idea, he adopted it. And that as a result, Israel has no commitment to looking for diplomatic solutions or negotiations, and is still refusing to recognize that the one way out of this is the Land for Peace agreement, which was implicit in Rabin's proposal back in 1993, and also the Arab League in 2002 said there could be recognition, there could be a solution to all the problems if Israel gave back the occupied territories. So now you look at Netanyahu, he's a devout believer in force, in the idea that the whole land of biblical Israel or greater Israel belongs to the Jewish people, and no one else has a claim to it. And that whatever is necessary to defend it should be done. Now, he's merging himself with the idea of Israel because he knows that his ability to stay in as prime minister depends on his ability to keep anyone who would want to change this completely overwhelmed. And that's why war is for him an obvious solution. So with all that as a backdrop, what's clear is I agree with you completely. This decision, which supposedly has led to at least 400 deaths in the last 12 hours, killed by Israeli artillery and drones and air power, and the prospect that there will be a strike on Iran, and that Trump has ordered attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, all of this is very ominous. And at the very point where Trump is conducting a phone call with Putin, which could lead to some higher resolution of the Ukraine situation, why allow this to happen? And this is where you see the importance of what the French and the British and Netanyahu are doing as a coordinated action to keep these wars going. And so I think that's the thing we have to take from it. It doesn't make it less dangerous to understand it, but it is coming from this idea that might makes right, and that war represents the best way of sustaining an empire.
Well, it sounds medieval. It's the kind of thinking that we thought we got past, maybe even 1,000 years ago. What has happened to our view of humanity and the world? It's happened so fast. But I don't know what, 4 or 5 generations, and now here we are. Um, that idea that there has to be a separation between the Zionist state and everybody else, comes from this British Zionism, and you mentioned this uh, iron wall idea that is, you just said it. I mean, it is Israeli policy not to negotiate and to just, but I've never seen until the past 5 years or so, the claim to the biblical idea from Genesis of this huge greater Israel. And now it seems to be a fairly mainstream view, which brings me to the question of another very important group that you brought my attention to 6 or 8 months ago, and I've been studying since, and that is the Christian Zionists and the incredible voting power that these folks have. Once again, coming out of that political Zionism that you and your colleagues have described so well in so many great articles that I've read. So I guess what can we do about all of this, mystical, biblical, kind of a Gnostic idea of it's inevitable. I love Bob Marley says, some think it's all a part of it. We have to fulfill the book. That little rhyme sticks with me from his music. So I don't know. I guess I'll toss all that back to you.
Well, you just tossed about 10 different items, so let me see if I can piece a few of them together. I think, look, the Christian Zionism is one thing that, I wrote an article on this back in 2005, talking about George W. Bush, and the influence of fundamentalists on him, and how his sense is that he survived being an alcoholic by eventually turning his life over to Jesus. And what he meant by that is that he's going to, in fact, he even said to people before the 2000 campaign that he thinks he was chosen by God to be president. And that was put in him by some of these Christian Zionist preachers, including one whose name escapes me at the moment, but used to walk through the cities of Texas with a giant cross on his shoulder and call people to acknowledge their sins and throw themselves to the mercy of Jesus. Now, what's important about this, in my thinking, is that we see it in terms of a mainstream movement in some Christian sects in the United States, a section of the Southern Baptist Convention, some of the more radical Protestant and movements. But where does it come from originally? This was a belief of the British aristocracy. They saw themselves as directly descendant from Jesus and the apostles, and of being the chosen people that were designed to take over the world. And this goes back to Prince Edward, who later became George the whatever, or maybe it was King Edward. Yeah, King Edward VII. He set up something called the Palestine Exploration Fund, which sent Christian missionaries from England to Palestine to do a geological and geographical survey of the whole area to find out where they should go when the Battle of Armageddon was going to happen. They actually, and some of this was there, I'm sure you know this, Oliver Cromwell. Around him, there were people who had this view also, that in order to have the second coming of Jesus, you have to have all the Jews of the world rounded up and sent to Palestine. And so this is what's in people like Reverend Hagee of the Cornerstone Baptist Church in San Antonio. There are others who have this view. But think about how it fits in with the oligarchy's geopolitics. you get a large section of the population that's already suffering. Many of the people who belong to these groups are poor or poorly educated, sad. You know, besides the church, they listen to country music, which basically has themes like, if you want to keep the beer real cold, put it next to my ex-wife's heart. You know, people who are demoralized and
Oh, I
depressed.
like that. I like that.
Yeah,
Can I steal that?
sure. Or, you know, things like, I have Lubbock in my rear view mirror. You know, the idea that there's nothing wholesome and decent about life and you're a sinner. You know, like the Amazing Grace song, who saved a wretch like me. So if that's your self-conception, the idea that there's something outside of comprehension that might give you salvation, and you can be a sinner and still be saved if you're willing at some point to accept Jesus as your personal savior. It fits in. It's a very skillfully crafted religious belief to take people who don't have a lot and make them dependent on something outside of any action that they can take. And so, you know, look at the wars that have been fought over this. And you mentioned you thought we were over this 1,000 years ago or more. Well, actually, the closest we came to getting over it was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. After massacres of Christians against Christians in the 30 Years' War in Europe, a decision was made: if we're going to survive as a civilization, we have to put this behind us. We have to literally adopt the golden rule as a policy of statecraft. Do unto other nations as you would have them do unto you. The idea of the benefit of the other. And this came out of a long fight in European history that goes back to the Council of Florence in 1438. And I mean, there's a whole history to it. But all of a sudden, you want to look at the point that this turned in terms of the bigger strategic picture. 1999, the Satanist Tony Blair goes to the Council of World Affairs in Chicago and proclaims the end of the era of Westphalia. Because part of what the Westphalian doctrine says is that non-interference in other nations. Well, Blair pushed the responsibility to protect. If a group of nations that are self-appointed better citizens, like the unipolar order, concludes that a nation is not being good to its people, it's not democratic, then it has the right to intervene, the responsibility to intervene. And that's what Blair was pushing. And that's why he said we're in the post-Westphalian era. We no longer have this responsibility to respect other nations, including other nations' sovereignty. But you have to have what is now being called again, and I can't believe how they don't see the irony of this. Starmer calls it the coalition of the willing. He took that from Bush and Cheney. The coalition of the willing are going to come and force Russia to accept a defeat on Ukraine. Now, this is where you see, there's probably a part of Starmer who believes that God has smiled on him and sent him to Earth to fulfill the mission of Tony Blair. And it's not surprising that his top advisor, Jonathan Powell, was the top advisor of Tony Blair. So you have this coherence between an ideology that's drafted based on the self-conception of people who have given up that they can ever be a success in life, and the people who think they are a success in life because they were chosen by God. So you have the arrogant establishment, and then you have the hoi polloi, the average person. And it's the establishment that pulls the strings to get the population to support such things as these kinds of wars. And that's characteristic of an imperial system. The good news, John, is this imperial system is not going to last that much longer. The bad news is it's still got a lot of power and can do a lot of damage. And we have to fight our way through this.
Wow. And I feel like 10 things just came back at me. Uh, I had to put a little footnote there about the Christian Zionism, because I I have to admit, I love to sing Amazing Grace, and I have a bit of that feeling in me too. I grew up Catholic, but all around me was Protestant. My mother, although she didn't ever talk about religion, I think she had a fairly Protestant outlook. Anyway, I think that there's a lot of room between the strict biblical, the Schofield Bible thumping Zionist in the, among Protestantism, and those that simply have an association with the transformation from having been a sinner and now hopefully not to sin anymore with the help of Jesus. I do think that's a large part of American culture that was there before this political Zionism has been laid upon it. Over the centuries, through the help of vehicles like the Oxford Press that pressed so many of those Schofield Bibles and distributed them everywhere. The the in, the insinuation of British political ideas into people's religious thought, you know, it's not, you don't have to be stupid to have that happen to you. I guess I'm also trying to say, it's I want to defend that milieu of people that are still reasonable and not jumping in with Netanyahu of Yahoo. Let's get rid of all these Palestinians and build our resort.
But let me come back at you at one of the axioms of this, who saved a wretch like me.
Yeah.
And this is something that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has put in her 10 fundamental principles for establishing a new security and development architecture. The question is, does original sin mean every child is born sinful? Or is every child just underdeveloped? And I think this is an important conception, an important difference, because some of what exists in the United States with the craziness around sexual belief, the idea that, sex is bad, or on the other side, it doesn't matter, it's a pleasure. The idea that we are born in sin and that we have to have some higher power make us unsinful. And as opposed to the idea that we're all born as potentially creative beings, but it's part of the role of family and society and religion to help develop that child that comes into the world, who I would say is not sinful, but is underdeveloped. And the problem is that how do you create a capability to develop the character of that child? And this is what the Greeks were involved in, what Plato was writing about in his many dialogues, what Socrates dedicated his life to, the development of character. Character meaning a connection between your mortal life and your ability to affect change in the world. And, we have a certain sense of littleness now that comes from this, partly because of the size of the world population, the fact that you have some people who are multi-billionaires and the rest of us are counting our pennies. You have all these things that would tend to make you humble, but being humble doesn't mean you don't have power, because your power is in your creativity, your ability to do something with your free will and with your personal character to make a change in the world. And I see it in my children who are struggling with this idea of the green revolution in Germany, and coming home and hearing Papa talk about how we have to change, get a new security arrangement for the world. And on the other hand, well, what's wrong with what we've got? At least we have food, we're happy, we have our sport, we have our television. You see this all the time, these contradictions. But ultimately, it comes down to, what do you believe is the nature of man? And that's why Lyndon LaRouche was always very insistent that, the music to the Amazing Grace, it's a nice tune. But if you really think through the words, it does instill in people this sense of littleness and sinfulness as a natural condition, and that you need help from something outside of yourself to attain grace. And that's why Lynn picks on that. I tend to look much more at the what I saw in Texas for 30 years, the Southern culture and the bluegrass and country music, which, there's always someone who's sad. My wife left with my best friend and I miss him. These kinds of songs.
Well, yeah, there's never been any operas like that, I'm sure. All right, Harley, I got to go back one thing, and that is that when you're talking about this idea that we're born with original sin, that's not a Protestant idea originally. That goes way back in Christian religion.
Yeah.
That's Catholic. It's very Catholic, and that's why we have the sacrament of baptism, and they baptize you, real on. And well.
But what does each baby have to do with the fact that Eve convinced Adam to eat from the apple?
Well, it's kind of like Shakespeare, isn't it? It's ceremony, but for ceremony, he wouldn't be the king, but for ceremony, you wouldn't have a Catholic Church. And what it does is it unites all the people in that congregation. They've all got the sprinkle on their head, and somebody's their godparents, and it unites the congregation in a serious way that helps to keep that congregation together, as well as, maybe some people believe it. I never believed it. I always thought that's a ridiculous idea, original sin. And, I like to go back and look at Genesis and read it from all kinds of different ways. And there's many, many, many ways to look at the Adam and Eve story. And it doesn't always have to come out that way. So but John,
as someone who likes opera and Shakespeare, that one of the things we've lost in our society today is this higher quality of thinking called metaphor. The ability to have a story which has a meaning, which is not contained within the words itself. And it's the quality of thinking that it evokes or provokes that is where the truth is, as opposed to the story itself. And I think the problem is people get caught up in the story and they miss the intent. And it's especially true if you read the gospel according, the four gospels, who especially I think Matthew was clearly a Platonist. They were really grappling with, how do you present these ideas that are outside of the body, that are part of the spirit? What is the spirit, the meaningful quality of the Holy Ghost in Catholic theology, or the spirit? So I think these are important questions, but I don't think most people think about them when they think about, should we give Netanyahu 2,000-pound bombs? What they're thinking about is they've been told that the Palestinians are animals and are beasts, and Israel has to respond to the provocation of Hamas. Now, a nation has an absolute right to defend itself against an attack like that. But to go out and start slaughtering children, that doesn't defend you from that. And that's where you see there's something wrong with the whole narrative.
I think everybody has a sense of responsibility, and I don't know how to express it, except that we all can rise up to to our responsibilities as fellow humans.
Yeah.
This is where it's all gone. It's gone to the point where you bomb civilians. That was dishonorable for a whole lot of history. We transitioned from champions like David and Goliath to armies, and then big armies in the field, and then mechanized big armies in the field, and then now after World War II, we have this kind of magical horror life that we live under a nuclear bomb threat that somehow some people thought would be a way to keep the peace, but in fact, it's just enabled the growth of military force to a point now where, I mean, if you watch the Ukraine war, there are these drones that they have and these incredible, horrible bombs that blow up at some like 3,000 degrees and just suck the air out of everything. Thousands of people getting killed every week, just on and on and on. It's and how, I don't know. I just like I was saying about how I felt this morning as I was looking at this news. It's like, Harley, I don't know, man. I worry about it.
When you look at the news, the first thing you heard this morning was that Putin and Trump are going to be talking.
Yeah.
Second thing you hear is that Starmer has a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. Then you hear that Kaja Kallas, the so-called High Minister for Foreign Affairs of the European Union, is saying the same slogan, the ball is in Russia's court. And next thing you see is that the impetus toward war has the upper hand in the news. And so then it seems as though the way it's presented, and I listen to BBC, so this is, of course, the center of control. But what do they say? They basically say that Putin is going to use his control over Trump to get him to accept a continued war, whereas the rest of the world is trying to stop this war with a ceasefire. And then you realize that of the 30 nations that went to Starmer's meeting, only a few of them committed to troops. Most of them wouldn't commit to troops. So where's the coalition of the willing? And you begin to pierce through this, that there's so much propaganda. And the problem is it's really hard to tell what you can believe. And this is where it's so important to develop individual capability to do critical analysis, critical thinking. And this is what should be taught in our schools. This is why reading Shakespeare is so important, because Shakespeare was a genius at presenting real history as though it's a play, as though it's a drama, like the history plays, the Richard III and Henry IV, parts 1 through 3, or Henry VI and Henry IV, part 1 and 2. You have the actual story somewhat hidden. Like Henry V, you know the play Henry V, yeah?
Somewhat, yeah.
Well, he was considered a great hero by the Bush crowd because he was someone as a child, he was running around drinking, cavorting, and then he became a great military leader. Now, if you read between the lines, what you find out is that he was being manipulated by the church. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't want to have their tax money taken for the country. But people who talk about Henry V and George Bush as great examples of recovering from alcoholism and being a good, responsible leader miss the fact that Bush, like Henry V, was controlled by other people. And that's why if you actually study Shakespeare and work on the ideas and look at it as a whole, as opposed to one story here and then a story there, you begin to get a quality for critical thinking. And that's why some of the greatest of our founding fathers were Shakespeare scholars. John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln used to recite some of the Shakespeare plays in his cabinet meetings. Could you imagine Trump doing that, or Biden? No, I mean, that's why classical culture is so important, because there were people who thought these things through on a higher level that we can learn from.
And I think that's part of what troubles me about this, about what we were talking about with Christian Zionism, is that that's not Christianity as I think Lincoln understood it. That and people of that time were much more literate than people are now. I mean, you might read thousands of books, but a lot of them are just junk and trash. Whereas back then they only had a few books, but it was the Bible, it was Shakespeare, it was some other great works if they were lucky, and perhaps a dictionary. But the idea of being very, very literate was an aspiration of the people, and that aspiration still survives, and I don't think it's drowned out by any literal reading of scripture. There is.
Well, I can give you an example from my high school. I had a very religious teacher for my honors English class in 12th grade. And he had us do things like we spent a week in the class with everyone reading the Gettysburg Address, everyone taking a turn reading it, and then talking about what it meant to them. And at first, most of my classmates and I thought, this is kind of a crazy thing to do. But you actually see the poetry of that address. It's an incredibly powerful poetic appeal to a higher sense of human responsibility. And it ends with the government of, by, and for the people. Not as a didactic lesson, but as something that you get through the experience of what did these people sacrifice their lives for. And, again, in Lincoln, there's so many of these phrases, with malice toward none. That's the Christian view.
That's right.
And it's expressed to an enemy that was trying to tear apart the country on behalf of either defending slavery or states' rights, the right to have slaves. It always kills me when someone says, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Yeah, the state's right to have slaves. So, and then you look at the works such as Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift, which educated a whole generation of Englishmen. There were these great works. Dante's work on the Commedia, the going from the Inferno up to paradise. And who do you encounter in the Inferno? Well, some of the religious leaders that everyone would know. So you have this kind of potential through classical education to shape those higher qualities of the human mind. And then you add science to it, real science. By the way, I just want to mention something that's really quite significant that's going on today in Germany. The vote in the Bundestag to change the constitution. Now, this is such a swindle. Here you had a coalition government which got smashed in the election a month ago, and they lost many of their seats. And yet today, before those people have to leave, like the lame duck session, they're the ones who are going to vote on the changing of the Constitution. And they're going to change it for what reason? To get a 400 billion euro defense allocation. Now, also, they want to put in the basic law that is in the Constitution, the green policy, so that anyone who criticizes the science, so-called, of the green transformation could be brought up on charges of being against the Constitution. And these are two things that are going to be voted on by many people who lost their seats in the last election. And the reason they're doing it this way, trying to get it done now, is because if they did it after next week with the new parliament, these would never succeed. because you need a 2/3 vote to change the Constitution. So Meritz is basically saying to the Greens, if you support me on the weapons policy, I'll put the green laws into the Constitution. Now, that's where you see the total perversion of what a republic is.
Yeah.
And there are, I just was on the phone before I got on with you with one of my friends who's a member of the parliament, who just said, how do I bring this up in the debate today? I won't even get a chance to speak. How do we do this? And, I had told him 2 weeks ago to put something out on it, and he didn't do it. But this is where you see what would have inspired him to go one step further. I don't know. I obviously didn't inspire him to do it. And could one person touch the conscience of enough people? You only need to change 11 votes to defeat this legislation. But you're going up against what? Money and power. So, that's part of the sad case that makes me not sleep too well at night these days.
You're right on the front lines here with this takeover of our, what we hope are still republics in the West.
And Helga Zeppler-Rusch was saying that this is really a cold coup in Germany. And it's interesting. She said that, and the same day, a very famous law professor at a university in southern Germany wrote a column saying this is a cold coup against the idea of the Constitution. It's so bad that even Merkel stands out as someone of conscience. She made a statement the other day. There's this German term, Putinversteher, which means Putin understander, someone who understands Putin. And she said, that's meant as a slander. And she said, why would it be a slander if someone's trying to understand what another country's leader is saying and doing? And coming from Merkel, whose lies helped set up the whole Ukraine war, maybe she's got a little bit of buyer's remorse.
Well, the point is that the people of these republics are allowing this to happen. And if the people don't see it, then it's going to happen. The control of the media is the battlefield for people's minds. And it seems to me that your laws now are going to prevent the media from presenting anything against the green agenda.
Yeah.
And, I already feel that your laws over there and some here too are not allowing us to express opinions about what's going on in the Middle East, in Gaza.
Well, look at this attack on this Columbia student.
Well, the Columbia student, I've looked at both sides of it, and I have to say there is enough evidence to say that he violated his green card. Whether it's selective prosecution or what is it, I don't know. But I can't just say that he's right out of the box innocent of violating the green card.
I think the issue with this is the intent.
Okay.
That if someone has expressed a statement once or twice or put out a statement somewhere that seems to go against what's accepted,
Yeah.
Is that something that has to come down with the full effect of the power of the state?
Doesn't have to.
So, what's the effect of it? It's to silence anybody who might feel inclined to speak out because of conscience. And if you look, John, over some of the discussion topics we've had, look at the handful of people who have spoken out. Someone like Ellsberg. We talked about the church committee. The handful of whistleblowers, the Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebes, people who lost their positions because they not only spoke truthfully, but for the Constitution. They spoke on behalf of the society. And what happens when you silence those people? And again, go back to the old English history, Thomas More. the original leader of conscience. He could have cut a deal. He didn't. And now we know about him, and he's someone to admire as a historic figure who stood for principle against despotism. There are very few people like that in history.
The meddlesome priest.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you. It's a terrible tragedy that the people just don't see it. The loss of everything, and I see it here. Most people that I think are really good liberals are more concerned about the rights of transsexual people than they are about World War III, and that's where I just can't understand. But I want to get back to something Jeffrey Sachs said about 2 weeks ago now, and when he spoke at the UN, and he said that
at the UN or the EU.
Oh, the EU. Thank you. And but as you know, one of the things he said was that these things are like the game theory that's studied at the Rand Corporation, and one of the game theories that they study and they play out is the game in which you never negotiate, you never concede anything to the other side. And he says, well, that's what they're playing out now, and it's consistent with what I observe with all the Democrats showing up with these little paddles,
Yeah.
and making the exact same speeches, using the same microphone and the same camera and in the same framing, and all of this looks to me like a lockstep effort to present a united front of hell no, we will not even honor you with a debate. We will not talk to you. We don't want to hear your side of it because we are right and you are wrong, and that's all I need to say.
Well, and that's where we've come to. If you look at the major newspapers in the country, most of them have the same editorial line, and the ones that differ within the same axiomatic bubble. There's a great fear of stepping out of line. For example, even people who say we should have a negotiated settlement in Ukraine still say, but Putin's a beast. Putin's a barbarian. Putin's the problem. How many people have listened to Lavrov and listened to Putin? Putin, you can find Putin if you look hard enough and see that he's given a whole number of speeches, and he's very provocative, but very thoughtful. And, it's Lavrov. I don't know if you saw the interview that he did with Judge Napolitano and Larry Johnson.
No.
It was fascinating because here's a guy who took the time to go through the Russian argument to some American podcasters. And he respected the American people enough to do that. And during the course of his discussion, it was very interesting. He said to Judge Napolitano at one point, I really appreciate your interviews with Jeffrey Sachs. So here you have the foreign minister of Russia who's commenting on the fact that in the United States, there are people who speak outside of the narrative bubble. But who hears that? I remember there was what's the person who did the JFK movie?
Stone,
yeah. Did a long interview with Putin, which was fascinating because he was challenging Putin on some things, and he was somewhat surprised at some of the things Putin said. If you don't see the people you think are enemies as human beings and don't try to discover why they do what they're doing, then you end up stuck in the logic of confrontation, provocation, and war. And then all you need is a false flag. And as we know, false flags are easy to raise. So Where I would say the real danger is we're a false flag away from a possible nuclear war in Europe. If Macron and Starmer can somehow find 20,000 Europeans to go into Ukraine, all you would need would be one of these Ukrainian Nazis to machine gun a bunch of them while they're sleeping. And that could trigger World War III.
Well, we say it. You said it. It can't be said more clearly. It's a real threat in the world right now, and I don't know how to get the liberal side, except for I can say I was encouraged to see that the Democratic Party's popularity has gone below 30% in the polls.
I'm
Maybe.
surprised it's still so high.
Well, so am I, but I mean, and this is poll, this is like major, so they wouldn't say that if it wasn't even worse. So yeah, maybe people are waking up. I don't know. I don't know.
I think, John, the problem, I think I've talked with you about this before, that people know what they don't like. And they don't like feeling oppressed. They don't like being lectured to, but they don't know what's the right thing. And that's a product of a deliberate destruction of our education system. I mean, economics is not that difficult to figure out. But if you present it in the current way as the quantum economics and the algorithms that go into determining derivative values, all of which have nothing to do with real economics. Real economics is transforming nature in such a way that it serves the needs of a growing number of people. And that's a question of science. That's a question of using science to figure out how many tons of fertilizer does it take to produce enough wheat to feed the world. There are things like that that can be figured out without fancy algorithms. But instead, we have people focused now on digital currencies and writing code and these kinds of things, which are essentially removed from the actual physical necessity of what real economic production is. That's why we need a new development architecture. And that's why if you look at what I find astounding is the prejudice against China. With people who know nothing about China, but are willing to go on at length about how the red Chinese are about to invade and cut everyone's throat, and they've got 30,000 troops on the Mexican border and more on the Canadian border. Where people just fall for these racist tropes. And if you look at what China's actually done, it's quite interesting. And it's something that I think would interest young people to see how a country went from being very poor and also a very bad dictatorship. I mean, there's nothing redeeming about Mao Zedong. And yet out of his party came Deng Xiaoping and then a whole group of reformers who focused on the physical economy. And so now when you have the Western bankers going over there saying, look how much money you could make if you got involved in derivatives, the Chinese shut that down. They're not going to do it. Now, then what do they say in the West? Well, that's Chinese dictatorship. Well, the Chinese say if you want to run a swindle, we'll put you in jail. In the United States, if you run a swindle and it's successful, you get on the front page of Forbes magazine.
Well, the big stopper, the non-starter for me generally is in my gut is totalitarianism. Which that's like we grew up in a time when our high school teachers told us about totalitarianism and how bad it was, and of course it existed in Russia and China, and we had Mao and the Little Red Book and everything. Yeah. So that's in us, and so we need to be re-educated. But I won't feel re-educated until I see a Bill of Rights for the Chinese people, and not to feel like if I go over there, I can randomly be picked up and thrown in some Chinese jail for practically nothing. So that fear is still there. It's not that I'm not willing to entertain, the fact that China has made a wonderful contribution to technology, and they're building these amazing fusion machines, and the, the the ability to raise all of these millions of people out of poverty. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff to be said, but I think maybe I'm characteristic of that resistance that you speak of, because I just won't give up my sense of hanging on to my individual rights.
Well, maybe you should go there, John, and see, because I'll tell you something. You're much more likely to get arrested when you come back to the United States than when you go to China.
Okay.
And we've seen that, maybe not in the United States, but we've seen that with Great Britain, that people who have gone, like Medhurst, the journalist, and a couple of others who come back to Britain and they get picked up at the airport. Why were you in Syria? Why were you here? Why were you there? But the other thing about China is, and this is something Helga brings up, and I haven't been there, so I'm speaking from friends of mine who have been there, some of whom were pre-inclined to support China, some of whom were not supporters of China. And what they said is that the people seem to be happy there. And unlike a lot of what you see in the United States, if your sports team doesn't win, you might be in a depression for months in the United States. So, I think the question really is, do people have a sense that their government is working for them or against them? And I think we see in the West governments that are controlled by private interests that really don't give a damn how you're doing.
I think you're absolutely right, and if I were living there, and I probably would be happy too. But still, that whole idea of liberty as being essential American characteristic, I kind of like it.
Well, it is, and that's why we have rebellions in the United States from time to time.
Yeah, boy, I hope we don't have another one, but I don't think anything's going to happen right now. That's the other thing I wanted to mention, was that it does appear that Trump has an incredible amount of power. That I mean, he's doing all of these amazing things, and nobody seems to be able to, like, look at Chuck Schumer. They're going along with it. Everything he does, it's like the worst thing they'll do is maybe send Bernie Sanders out to say something. But
the good thing about Schumer is, remember, he was the one who threatened Trump in the first term when he said the intelligence community has 6 ways from Sunday to get you.
Isn't that
now he sees the intelligence community is under Trump's control. Yeah. So maybe that's why Schumer's being so complacent.
Yeah, it's somehow power shifted into Trump's hands in a very serious way.
But that's why we have to make sure that Trump is not given a blank check. And that's why the LaRouche organization exists. We'll defend him when he's right, and we'll criticize him when he's wrong. And I think that's got to be the approach that people take. And not just say, well, I don't like Trump no matter what he does, or I love Trump no matter what he does. That's not really an essential American characteristic, is it?
Well, I think today, it's just such a beautiful day right here on Mystery Island, as we call it. I was out this morning with my. I'm just recovering from my broken wrist, but I was trying my hand with a little bit of digging in the dirt, and I was starting to think, oh, here's where I'm going to put the potatoes, and here's where I'm going to put the tomatoes, and just getting excited about that. But what the real the other big story of my lifetime is the transition from the time when people grew vegetables as a matter of course to that it's very extraordinary for people to actually go to the trouble of growing vegetables, and this mass-produced food, giant big box grocery stores everywhere that all the food comes flown in from somewhere else at all of that has taken away the connection to the earth and the soil that is also part of what America, really American character was built
Yeah.
on. And so folks now are so in love with their technology. And, there's a lot of history of, I never want to have to muck out a barn, again. I don't want my children to ever have to do it. I want them to be able to have that good life, and, we'll buy them the Chevrolet and give them the things that we didn't have. But now we've got so much of this technology, and we're using so much of our brains in technological space instead of engaging in the earth, that somehow, hopefully, people will see that there's got to be a stop. There's got to be a limit to it.
And John, I would say, besides engaging in the earth, people should engage in social discourse.
Oh, yeah.
There should be dialogue, and it should be okay to disagree.
It's got to be okay to disagree. That's that tactic of non-discussion that
Or else our Constitution is meaningless.
Or else it is meaningless indeed. We need to talk to each other, folks. And thanks again, Harley. This has been a very, very interesting and stimulating and lively discussion. And I look forward to the next one.
And I'll send you my article on the problem of Israel's national security as soon as I finish it.
All right. Thank you so much. All the best. And thanks again, Harley Schlanger. Bye now.